The Sleeping Beauty by Charles Perrault. Once upon a time there lived a king and a queen who were in greater sorrow than words can tell, because they had no children. They traveled to all the rivers of the world, made vows and pilgrimages, and said little prayers. Yet as hard as they tried, nothing worked. But at last the queen gave birth to a daughter. They held a beautiful baptism and gathered all the fairies that could be found in the kingdom to give as godmothers to their little princess. The king managed to find 7 fairies, and following the custom of fairies at the time, he had each one give her a gift. In this way, the princess was granted all the perfections imaginable. After the ceremonies of baptism, everyone present returned to the king's castle, where there was a great feast for the fairies. Their table places were set in magnificent style, each with a solid gold casket containing a spoon, a fork, and a knife of pure gold, all set with diamonds and rubies. But as each was sitting at the table, an old fairy came in who was not invited. She had not left her tower for 50 years, and people had believed that she was dead or under a spell. The king made her a place at the table, but there was no way to give her a solid gold casket like the others, since only 7 had been made for 7 fairies. The old fairy felt insulted and began to mutter some threats between her teeth. One of the young fairies happened to hear her and realized that she might give some harmful gift to the little princess. So as soon as they rose from their table, she went and hid behind the tapestry, so that she could speak last and repair as she could of the damage the old fairy would do. Soon the fairies began to give their gifts to the princess. The youngest gave her the gift that she would be the most beautiful person in the whole world. The second, that she should have a mind like an angel. The third, that all her actions would be admirable. The fourth, that she would dance perfectly. The fifth, that she would sing like a nightingale. And the sixth, that she would play every musical instrument to perfection. When the old fairy's turn came, she shook her head, not because she was old, but out of spite, and declared that the princess would prick her hand on a spindle and die. This terrible gift made all the guests tremble, and there was no one who did not weep. At that very moment, the young fairy came out from behind the tapestry and said these words aloud: "Do not worry, king and queen, that your daughter shall die. It is true that I do not have enough power to undo entirely what my elder has done. The princess will prick her hand on a spindle, but instead of dying, she shall only fall into a deep sleep that will last 100 years. In the end, a king's son will awaken her." The king tried to avoid this misfortune, foretold by the old fairy, by announcing a law at once, forbidding anyone on pain of death from using a spindle, or even having one in their home. One day, after 15 or 16 years, the king and queen happened to be out traveling. The young princess went chasing around the castle from room to room. When she went up the stairs, she came at last to a small attic at the top of a tower, where she saw a good old woman was sitting alone, spinning with her spool. The good lady had never heard of the king's ban on spindles. "What are you doing, my good woman?" said the princess. "I am spinning, my pretty child," replied the old woman, not knowing who the princess was. "My, how lovely!" said the princess. "How are you doing it? Let me try, so I can see if I can do it just as well." Now, for one thing, she was hasty and also very careless, but it was really because of the fairies' decrees that as soon as she took the spindle, it ran into her hand and she collapsed. The frightened old woman cried out for help. People ran from all parts. They threw water into the princess's face and unlaced her dress, slapped her with their hands, and rubbed their temples with the royal essence of Hungary, but nothing would revive her. Then the king, who came home when he heard of the commotion, remembered the prophecy of the fairies, and realized that all had happened as the fairies had said. He put the princess in the finest apartment of the palace, on a bed of gold and silver embroidery. She was so beautiful that she seemed like an angel. Even her fall had not taken the bright colors from her face. Her cheeks were carnation and her lips like coral. Only her eyes were closed. She could be heard breathing softly, which showed that she was not dead. The king commanded that she should be allowed to sleep undisturbed until the day of her awakening came. The good fairy who had saved her life, pronouncing that she would sleep 100 years, was in the kingdom of Madican, 12,000 miles away, when the accident happened to the princess. But she was informed at once by a little dwarf who had 7 league boots, that is, boots that one could use to travel 7 leagues in one stride. The fairy set out at once, and after an hour people could see her fiery chariot approaching, drawn along by dragons. The king gave her his hand to come down from the chariot. She approved of everything he had done so far, but because she had a very great foreknowledge, she also considered the future, when the princess would finally wake up, and how frightened she would be to wake up alone in this old castle. So this is what she did. She touched everything in the castle except for the king and queen with her wand. Governesses, maids of honor, ladies in waiting, gentlemen, officers, stewards, chefs, scullions, runners, guards, porters, pages, footmen. She even touched all the horses in the stable along with their grooms, the big mastiffs in the backyard, and the princess's little dog Puff, who was with her on her bed. No sooner had she touched them than they all fell asleep, to awaken only at the same time as their mistress, ready to serve her when she needed them. The very same spits that were ready for the fire, full of partridges and peasants, fell asleep, and the fire too. All this was done in a moment. Fairies work quickly. Then the king and queen kissed their dear child without waking her, and went out of the castle. They proclaimed laws forbidding anyone from approaching, but these bans were not needed, because within a quarter of an hour there grew all around the park a huge number of large and small trees with brambles and thorns so intertwined into each other that neither man nor animal could pass through. People could see nothing but the tops of the towers of the castle, and then only from far away. The fairies' magic contrived it this way, so that the princess had nothing to fear from meddlers while she slept. 100 years later, the son of a king who was ruling then, who came from a different family from the sleeping princess, happened to go hunting in the area. He asked what those towers were he saw over a great thick wood. Each of his companions told him of what they had heard. Some said it was an old castle haunted by ghosts. Others, that all the witches of the country held their rituals there. The prince did not know what to believe, but the old peasant spoke and said, "My prince, it was more than 50 years ago, but I heard from my father that there was a princess in this castle, the most beautiful princess in the world. She had to sleep for 100 years, and would be awakened by the son of a king, for whom she is waiting." This speech inflamed the young prince, and he decided at once that since this beautiful adventure had fallen to him, he would see it through to the end. His desire for love and glory drove him to set forth at once. But he had barely stepped toward the wood when all the great trees and brambles and thorns parted on their own to make a passage. He turned forward and entered a long avenue, at the end of which he saw the castle. He was quite surprised when the trees closed behind him as he passed, so that none of his people were able to follow. Yet he continued his way, for a young prince is always brave. He entered a large front court, where he beheld a vision that was enough to freeze him with fear. A terrible silence, with the image of death, appeared all around. All the collapsed forms of men and animals seemed like lifeless bodies. But when he saw the pimply nose and red face of the porters, he knew that they were only sleeping and that their cups, which still held some drops of liquid, showed clearly that they had fallen asleep while drinking. He continued across a large marble paved courtyard, climbed the stairs, and entered the guard room. The guards were standing in their ranks, weapons on their shoulders, and snoring their loudest. He went through several rooms full of gentlemen and ladies, all asleep, some standing, others sitting. At last he entered a room, all covered in gold, and there, lying on a bed, with the curtains open on all sides, was the most beautiful sight he had ever seen. A princess who appeared to be 15 or 16 years old, and whose radiant beauty was a thing bright and divine. He approached, trembling in his wonder, and knelt beside her. At that very moment the enchantment came to an end, and the princess awoke. She looked up at him with the tenderest eyes that ever shone at first sight. "Is that you, my prince?" she said. "You're late." The prince was charmed by these words, and especially by the way they were spoken. But he did not know how to show his joy and gratitude. He promised her that he would love her more than himself, but his words stumbled out with much love and little eloquence. Yet we should not be surprised that he was more embarrassed than she was. She had had time to think about what she would say to him, because although this is not recorded, the good fairy had given her very pleasant dreams throughout her long sleep. Even after talking for 4 hours, they had not said half of all they had to tell. Now the whole palace had awoken with the princess, and everyone returned to their task. Yet the servants, because they were not all in love, could feel that they were extremely hungry. The lady in waiting, who was as hungry as the rest, grew impatient and finally shouted out loud to the princess, "Supper is served." The prince helped the princess to rise. She was fully dressed in a beautiful style, but in an old fashion, with straight color like his grandmother. But this did not make her less beautiful, so he didn't mention it. They went into an apartment full of mirrors, and there they ate supper, served by the prince's stewards. Violins and oboes played old tunes, and played pretty well, for being out of practice for 100 years. Right after supper, the chaplain married them in the chapel of the castle, and they lived happily ever after.